My name is John Carroll. I'm the editor of Endpoints News, which is a recent startup, a daily biotech news service. Some people here may remember me as the former editor for a long time, former editor of Fierce Biotech. I do much the same thing. Maybe I'm a little bit more outspoken than I was before when I get the opportunity, which is pretty frequent. Appreciate everybody coming here today. Before I talk to any audience of any kind of size at all, I always ask them one question about where they get their biotech news. I don't care who you're reading, I just care what device you use, between laptops and cell phones. So quick show of hands, how many people here in the audience primarily get your biotech news on a laptop versus a cell phone? About 50-50, okay. Laptop. Okay, great. I appreciate that. It's something that I'm always kind of curious about because it says a lot about how we design a website and who we design it for in terms of whether it's a cell phone or a laptop. So it's handy for me to have. But I'd like to introduce my panel here today. We have a great conversation coming up, a very diverse panel about a key issue that really touches on every point in biopharma right now as it relates not only to preclinical through clinical development, but also things that are happening in the communities and among the various health payers. It's a very key issue as it relates to aging and health and healthy living over a longer period of time, particularly as you look at some of the demographics. To my left, starting at my immediate left, is Adam Antebi, the director of the Max Planck Institute for Biology of Aging. Sylvie Beauvais, the CEO of AIT Health. Peter-Andreas Loschmann, the Senior Medical Director, Germany and Medical Lead Internal Medicine for Pfizer Innovative Health, former wife, individual. And Gregor McDonald, the Senior Director, Neuroscience, Janssen Business Development for Johnson & Johnson. So I wanted to start by taking, kind of advancing or kind of working on this whole issue kind of backwards. As it relates, or forwards, depends on how you want to look at it. And I wanted to start with Sylvie and talk a little bit about what's happening right now, because you work with the EU. So if you could start by telling a little bit about what you're working on and how this relates to the state, the different communities here in Europe and what's going on as it relates to your work with some of the companies in the field.
Thank you, John. So AIT Health is a knowledge and innovation community. We were created last year by the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. These knowledge and innovation communities are created to address grand challenges. And our community addresses the challenges that are posed by an aging population and by the increase in chronic disease. So we are an association. We have today 138 partners. All large pharma companies, large medtech companies, small companies, leading universities in healthcare, clusters, bioenvironments, living labs, etc. So the idea is that we put together all the players in this space in order to generate innovation. So what is innovation? So it's translating the research that's being done into solutions that will reach patients. So our job is not doing the research, is actually translating that into solutions. And we work on three major strategies. One of them, of course, is looking at prevention. So as you know, if we look at the push from the demographic changes and the increase in chronic diseases, and we look forward, we can say that with the resources we have today, we'll not be able to provide the same quality of care to the people who need it tomorrow. So what can you do about that? So you can innovate, you can find new solutions, you can use technology. So technology is one of the areas we work with. How, for example, everybody knows the different initiatives that are being taken in e-health. So how can you use technology to improve? You can also shift resources in prevention. Problem with prevention is we lack the business models in prevention. And then, of course, another aspect, and those are the three strategies we have, another aspect is we see a lot of very innovative solutions that are being developed, but they don't get adopted. So there's a lot of barriers to adoption. So those are the three areas where we work. And the way we work is we facilitate innovation in those areas. So if I take a few examples, so one of them would be looking at, for example, a biotech company. I know there's a lot of biotech people here in the room. So Tubulis Technology, for example, is a small biotech company that has a very interesting model where they combine drugs basically to antibodies that will target the cancer cells. And this company is quite in early stage. And what we did through one of our programs, we helped them come in contact with about 100 stakeholders within 8 weeks. So we took them around Europe. They pitched actually to a lot of people. So both big companies or pharma companies, potential customers, if you like, also investors, of course. They tested their business model with a number of people in the area. And what they gained was a lot of knowledge in accelerating really their development in a very, very short time frame. So sharpening their business models, in fact, they changed actually their first focus. So that's one of the things we can do. We can help companies that have very innovative new solutions to get much faster into a commercial mode, if you like, and to get in touch with the people that need to get in touch in order to get to the next stage. Another thing that we do is a project I should mention briefly in frailty. So frailty is also an area that's quite important, and there we have a project that is running with different kind of players. So we have, for example, Abbott Nutrition. We have Atos on the digital side. They're working together at identifying biomarkers and also working with patients in order to develop prevention approaches for frailty, so that you will capture it earlier and allow people to have a high quality of life longer. So this is just two examples of the kind of projects or initiatives that we work with and we support in our organization.
Great. Collaboration seems to be a key here, I think, in anything related to aging R&D. One company that has a corner, particularly on this kind of a field. You're going to see a lot of different big companies as well as small companies working with others in the field. Same thing in terms of research. There's going to be a tremendous amount of cross-pollination when it comes to ideas and when it comes to the different kinds of technologies, because it's such a vast field. I mean, it touches on just about everything that's related to not only drug development, but also, you know, how we deal with longevity and healthy aging in the community itself. So Gregor, tell us a little bit about what you're doing, because I know collaboration is a key theme for J&J. You guys have set up an enormous global structure just to kind of soak up a lot of these new ideas and technologies.
Yeah, I mean, we recognized a number of years ago now that, you know, within our own laboratories, we could only ever do probably less than 1% of innovation and really explore, you know, novel scientific concepts. That, you know, 99% of the innovation was going on outside of our own walls. And so we really launched, you know, quite an aggressive external innovation and partnering organization called J&J Innovation. And that's composed of different component parts. You know, the team that I come from, Janssen Business Development, is more your traditional licensing, acquisition type activities. We are responsible for things normally post POC. We also are responsible for working with other big pharma companies, forming strategic partnerships, potentially commercial partnerships, divestitures, that kind of thing. But we work very closely with our Innovation Center colleagues, with our J-Labs colleagues, with colleagues in Janssen Development Corporation, to really try to source the very best innovation, transformational innovation, wherever it exists across the globe. And that's across our different sectors, the pharma sector, the medical device sector, the consumer sector, because we also recognize that with some of these major healthcare challenges and certainly diseases of an aging population, you know, we're not just going to be able to treat this with a pill, with a pharmacological intervention. It's going to have to be, you know, a mix of all different types of you know, pharmacological and social care and all other sort of infrastructure around that patient. And so we try to take that holistic approach. We're also very much trying to move the paradigm from a time where we used to diagnose and treat disease to one where we try to preempt and or predict and preempt that disease. And so we're investing a lot in early stage biomarkers in diagnostics to be able to identify early signs of disease, to identify patients that are at risk of that disease and be able to intervene early in that disease progression, and hopefully, in an ideal world, make that patient go on a different trajectory such that they don't develop that disease. Now, You talked about collaboration. That's again not something that one company can do alone. So as well as in collaborating and partnering with a lot of different scientific groups, we try to play a very active and leading role in a lot of consortia, working with other pharma partners, working with government agencies, working with regulators to try and establish better clinical trials paradigms. So we invest strongly, for instance, in EPAD, which is a cross-pharma sector initiative in Alzheimer's disease clinical trials to try and run better adaptive clinical trials. We're investing in the Dementia Discovery Fund, which is at an earlier stage, trying to harness more innovative mechanisms and targets that may be implemented in disease, and trying to, in a more share risk way, invest in developing that science. So really at all stages of the drug discovery and development process across all of our sectors, through our various groups, we're trying to really bring that partnering element.
One of the interesting aspects about J&J also is that you don't just deal with the pharmacologics, the drugs and things like that. You also deal with devices. You also deal with the consumer end of things as well. So a variety of different kinds of technologies being applied here. Also, just FYI, Gregor also used to work in Alzheimer's research, early stage Alzheimer's research, before he got into this area, which is a field I think we've seen a lot of work in, and we'll see a continuing amount of work in for some time. One of the things we were talking about a little bit before was the need for collaboration as it relates to Alzheimer's research. There's going to be probably a lot of different things that are going to be happening there as it relates to using a variety of different therapeutics to work with patients and to provide a better kind of life for them. Obviously, there's not been much real progress, or at least proven progress, over the last 10 years or so. So, Peter, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your aspect, how you get involved in this. I know that collaboration is also a big theme of yours as well, advisor.
Yeah, I think we are by no means different from our friend competitors. So we have enormous amounts of collaborations. To the collaboration with other pharma companies, startup companies, I would like to add that collaboration with academia and research institutions is becoming more and more important and more being implemented. We have several models, as all the other pharma companies. We have nice acronyms for the ways we are collaborating. And I think the secret is that in the future to become faster, we have to do much more translational work, where we really have an hypothesis and then bring together the best brains from pharma and the researchers, trying to develop the new approaches as quickly as possible, because patients cannot wait. When it comes to research topics, I mean, Pfizer is a medium-sized pharmaceutical company, so we have quite a few indications where we are working on. Prevention is an important part. Don't underestimate vaccinations. We can do that very, very early, and we know from at least one Nobel Prize winner that this can prevent cancer and diseases in later stage, something we will be exploring, I think, in the future much more closely. Immune oncology is going into the same direction, but of course, neurodegenerative diseases, I think I spent my lifetime, at least in the lab, from preclinical to preclinical stuff there, and this is still unsolved, so we still don't know how to cure patients suffering from Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, any neurodegenerative disease. And what is also very important, although we know the principles for a number of rare neurological diseases much better than others, ALS, for example, there is still no cure. So we have been working against hypotheses for years and years and years, and there's much more to be done, and we are trying to offer opportunities of collaborations to anyone who has a good idea and a solid hypothesis to be tested.
Well, one of the collaborative ideas we were discussing ahead of time as well is that a few months ago, Pfizer put up a program with IndieGoGo, and this is in the United States, where they basically said, come to us, they put the word out, come to us, and if it's a really good idea, we'll fund this idea with $50,000 just to see where it goes. And I think that this is one of the examples that I've seen where a lot of companies are doing some different things, where they're just trying to generate some ideas and put some money behind some ideas.
Just to add another initiative Pfizer brought to life, that is, we are offering any molecule which has been terminated in clinical development for all reasons except for safety or tolerability issues is open to anyone who would like to develop this molecule in a repurposing way. So this would save a lot of time. Repurposing of all old molecules, I think we will be touching on that later on, is a big issue, an unsolved problem. And just to open another dimension of discussions, any preventive treatment does require diagnostics, and I think around the globe we don't have the funding mechanisms in place to pay properly for diagnostics which are being developed. In Germany, this is a big issue. I know the details here much better, but what I'm learning from other countries, it's simply the same. Who is paying for the diagnostic procedures? Who will identify the patients for your drug treatment?
And even more complex problem in the United States. So tell me a little bit about, I'm just kind of curious, I mean, we're talking a little bit about the demographics of Europe versus the United States. This is seemingly maybe a bigger issue in Germany than
as I said, usually we are admiring the US because they are so far in advance of our developments here in Germany. With the aging, it's different. I have a ranking in my brain that is the most aged population in industrial countries is Japan, followed by surprisingly Spain, then Germany, and then the US. I'm missing out a number of other important countries there. So the developments in terms of demographics we are now seeing at the old continent, this is something the US will anticipate to see in we'll see 5 years later to 10 years later. So the number of people being above 60 is drastically increasing. This is good news for me and others, but on the other hand, if this aging is not healthy, then this is causing a lot of problems. If I may, half a second.
Sure.
There are 3 topics which I'm looking at in my daily life. This is treatment for rare diseases, identification of safe medicines for children, and the overlooked part is to look in a mirror fashion to the aged population. So we are very frequently, we don't know enough of our drugs, how they are reacting to an old organism with impaired renal function, metabolic function, a shift in the balance between lipids and water. And this is something we need to work on. And if a company intends to work on this patient population, this is a starting point for us as a company selling products for these indications for long. It's something we need to do. We need to learn more about the toxicology and the side effects of products we are using for long.
Which begins at a preclinical stage. Adam, tell us a little bit about the kind of work you're doing. And I think also we can segue from some of the preclinical work you're doing also to repurposing as well, because really in research right now, as it relates to diseases involving aging, it seems like there's not only a tremendous amount of work being done on the animal research side, but it really goes all the way through towards repurposing metformin and things like that, some of the things that we're seeing in more advanced studies.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's an incredibly exciting time now. Over the last several decades, preclinical research has revealed that there are evolutionarily conserved signaling pathways that are found from yeast and worms and flies and mice all the way up to humans, and that these seem to be regulating longevity and health. And some of these pathways, many of you may know the insulin IGF pathway, the mTOR pathway, AMP kinase. These have been discovered through basic research. And now drugs are being used to actually tamp with those pathways and extend both life and health. And I think this is quite a remarkable finding. And it really raises this really novel and interesting concept that while we've been very successful in treating various age-related diseases in a piecemeal fashion, for example, cancer and cardiovascular disease, the idea is that aging is a major risk factor for many of these age-related diseases, and if we can understand the underlying principles of aging and longevity itself, we can tap into the natural health enhancing mechanisms within the body and within the cell, and treat many diseases of aging at once. And this is really not such a fantasy. Many of the genetic interventions that have been discovered can not only extend the lifespan, but can ameliorate several different models of disease, such as neurodegeneration and also diabetes. And so, I think, so now the idea that's emerging is that we can repurpose some of these drugs that are targeting these pathways, and you mentioned metformin. I think this is an amazing example of how we can use this to treat multiple morbidities. So metformin, as you know, is an anti-diabetic drug, and it's worked reasonably well. And the striking finding is that this drug not only can ameliorate diabetes, but it lowers the all-cause risk of death across the board. In fact, those that are undergoing treatment have a lower mortality than non-diabetic controls. And it raises the possibility that these drugs can be purposed against several different age-related diseases. And the FDA has now approved the idea of using metformin to treat multiple morbidities. And so I think this is a very exciting time. And we're just on the cusp of discovering other things as well.
May just add another piece of information to that one. Metformin, biguanides have been developed in 1922.
Yeah.
It has been synthesized then. And now, almost a century later, we still don't know the mechanism of action. It's still the most widely used anti-diabetic, oral anti-diabetic drug, but that FDA does approve prospective research with a compound with an unknown mechanism of action. This is another revolution.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, aging research and things, because it strikes me that a lot of people are having to rethink that the way they look at drug development now, as it fits into aging R&D. I mean, it's not your traditional, here's my disease, here's my target, this is what I want to hit. As you've got lung cancer or something like that, this is what we want to do. So what, from your perspectives, and Sylvie, maybe we'll start with you, because you're looking at a lot of the different communities as well in terms of what's happening out there among the states here in the EU. How much of a rethink, I'm curious, just in terms of interacting with companies, how much of a rethink is involved here as it relates to what companies are doing and how it's going to fit into what people are expecting? I mean, do people, a lot of the people that you work with, do they think about this in terms of something that they're looking for from the company? Do they expect a different kind of an approach? Or is this something that's just kind of outside their field? I'm just curious what they think about research as it relates to what's going on in their lives right now.
So I'm not a research expert, but I think that we see two things, at least within our environment. One of them is actually the fact that an initiative like AIT Health is created, i.e. we put together companies in pharma, medtech, ICT, so different kind of competence areas working together. We have projects where you have a nutrition company working together with a pharma company and with an ICT company, for example. So, and this is quite new. I mean, it used to be that, you worked within pharma or you worked within ICT, but there was not. And I think that is due partly to the complexity of the challenge, where you need to approach it from different angles, and the solutions, as you were pointing out before, also are not going to be one molecule, solves all the problem. So I think that's one area. An area where we also see a similar kind of rethinking is in education, particularly medical education. The medical education has been for 100 years, I believe, very much focusing on specializing. So you have been sort of studying bits and pieces and certain pathways, and and today we realize that is actually a problem when you are looking at a complex system, and we're moving more and more at going back to the individual as a complex system and looking at the system. And you were just mentioning different pathways that have that impact different kind of diseases, for example. So I think we see also a translation in terms of how we educate the people that are going to deal with diseases, for example, the fact that also needs to be revised so that you have a better understanding of these things.
One of the things that's happening as it relates to research in this field is some of the new companies that I'm seeing in the United States as well as in Europe are focused a lot on genetics and the new research that you were seeing in genetics about what causes disease, how diseases develop. There's been a lot of frustration on the neurosciences side of things, obviously, as it relates to some of the things that have been tested and haven't proven to be so effective. Parkinson's, ALS, Alzheimer's have been very frustrating, big diseases to deal with. But a lot of new companies have been coming along, kind of using genetics research as a kind of a new basis for examining things and taking a new approach. For a company like J&J, I mean, you've got an opportunity with a kind of global structure you've got. I know sometimes, last time I was in London talking to Patrick Verheyen, when he was in charge of the London office, he talked about how they'd sometimes talk with the people in Shanghai, and it'd be about 3 o'clock in the morning their time, but they'd get everybody together. I mean, globally, you get everybody together at one time. So do you all ever talk about this in terms of just kind of bringing up things, reviewing things? I mean, does the genetics research cause you to do anything differently at a company like J&J or Pfizer?
I think that's one of the factors that we consider when we're looking at the diseases to go after. Is there a strong genetic basis for this disease? Can we understand the pathways that are dysfunctional in this disease? Can we intervene early in disease progression to change completely the trajectory of that disease? So we're definitely considering the genetics around the disease. When a target that we are working on, or have an interest in has a genetic basis, then of course we have a much higher confidence that if we can develop, safe and effective therapeutics against these targets, then that could go on to be a very useful medicine. Again, if I focus on the Alzheimer's space, there's a lot of interest for many years now on the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease. And really, if you look at the genetics around, the amyloid hypothesis and the role of beta secretase in cleaving amyloid precursor protein to give you the toxic forms of amyloid that eventually deposit as plaques, the genetics there is quite compelling, both mutations that cause people to develop more aggressive earlier forms of Alzheimer's disease, over 230 different mutations that lead to more aggressive forms of Alzheimer's disease. There's also a protective mutation identified a few years ago in an Icelandic population, which essentially makes beta secretase about 40% less efficient at cleaving APP. And over the lifetime of an individual, they'll be completely protected from developing Alzheimer's disease. So people over 100 who you would expect to be suffering from dementia, completely clear of Alzheimer's disease. So when you have a strong genetic basis for a disease like that, it gives sort of drug discovery and development teams a lot of confidence to go after these targets. So indeed, it's a major factor in our consideration.
And Pfizer?
Yeah, of course, we cannot neglect the importance of genetics, but when looking at it from a theoretical point of view, I would think that monogenetic diseases will be cured sooner than later. But unfortunately, the pathophysiology of most of the diseases, even neurodegenerative diseases, is much more complex than a single gene shift or things like that. So we should not forget the environment, the epigenetics, all these things we barely understand, which have an influence on the disease progression or occurrence. The metabolomic data, when looking at these huge amounts of germs living into my gut, which I hardly know the names, or I don't know the names at all, and no one, I believe, has an idea whether these are good guys, bad guys, and in which constitution they should be there. So we have to learn an awful lot to make something out of it, which is then helping patients. So, and as in the past, things will happening step by step. So my first hope is that we now better understand in a couple of months whether or not amyloid is a good or a bad guy. I have a bet on that one. As soon as we know this, then I think we have much more energy to focus on things which are in the pathway.
Well, it was interesting just watching the progress that Biogen made with aducanumab, which gave a lot of people a lot more confidence in the amyloid thesis
one should publish not phase 1 results and interim and make a fuss out of it. Sorry, but
No, that's an excellent point. It's one that I've made
but-
myself.
but this is something. This was a mistake, I believe. By the way, by a group which is prone to do that. We had previous experiences in the past. So I keep my fingers crossed that the results will hold. But it happened more than once that these things did not.
Well, it's interesting because they repeated a lot of the early stage data that they had for aducanumab and got exactly the same response that they did the first time, particularly from the UK newspapers, which was we have a near-term cure for Alzheimer's, which is, of course, wildly out of the park. One of the things that I've often seen when it comes to early stage research work related to any major disease or diseases of aging is that they very quickly to get the attention of the tabloids. When they do cover any kind of new medical research at all, it's one that it either involves a dreadful disease like Alzheimer's, or it involves one in which people might think about living for a much longer period of time. So I'm curious from your perspective, Adam. I mean, there's a lot going on right now in terms of early stage research. I recently saw a $116 million venture round go to a company in the United States called Unity. It was put together. It includes investments from Jeff Bezos at Amazon, a number of biotech venture investors which are looking at senescent cells. If you were to look at the kind of research that's being translated right now into the clinic, we're just still very early stage. What are the sorts of technologies and the companies that you're looking at that seem to be in a particularly exciting kind of a field?
Well, that's certainly one of them. This whole area of cell senescence is extremely exciting, and only recently have there been cogent in vivo models for this, and that eliminating these senescent cells seems to improve health. And I think the other area that's really promising, I think, is proteostasis. So we talked.
Do you want to explain what senescent cells are
Yeah.
about?
So senescent. So what happens is cells in your body, when they're healthy, they can divide, or they can turn into a skin cell. But sometimes when they encounter stress, or they go into what's called a senescent state, and they just sit there, and it's supposed to, but they don't just sit there and do nothing. They actually secrete inflammatory cytokines, which can cause all sorts of inflammation and distress within the body. And initially they're protective, but later in life they actually may do damage. And so if you accumulate too many of these senescent cells, it could impede organ function and impede health. So the idea is that by removing some of these cells, you may actually improve organismal health. And so there are companies now that are looking at this in whole animal models, and I think they're also going to try, there's some drugs that have been developed that can eliminate these cells. And so this is under research and under development. I think another really exciting area is the area of protein homeostasis. So we heard a lot about neurodegenerative diseases and how particularly Alzheimer's is very refractory to treatment, and actually many of these dementias are, and we really don't have a cure or a good treatment. And I would posit that one of the reasons for this is we haven't really been thinking about it correctly, and I think what we need to tap into are the protein quality controls in the cell, the natural control mechanisms that help protein do their job. And that goes awry with aging, and it affects many different types of neurodegenerative diseases, ataxias. And so by tapping into these quality control mechanisms that exist within the cells, I think we can begin to tackle some of these very challenging diseases. And this is happening in a number of different companies that I know of. Yeah.
So let's open this up. I mean, in terms of everyone else on the panel, are there any kind of technologies or any kind of new systems that you're looking at that at a still fairly early stage that you think might one day have an impact as it relates to aging and health? Peter?
Yeah, If it's preclinical, I cannot talk about it. I would assume that we are looking into that. But I think we can learn from the molecules which have been developed and which have a unique mechanism of action, an awful lot of what is mechanistically ongoing, thinking about mTOR inhibition and such mechanisms you have been talking about, metformin. So there may well be mechanisms which can be tackled, although I doubt a bit that there will be a golden bullet shooted to a cell and then all the other cells will become healthy or getting better. It would be nice, but I find it a bit unlikely that a thing like that would happen. And we have to be very careful, because think about the waves of excitement when deprenyl, an MAO-B inhibitor, was introduced into the treatment of Parkinson's disease, and people thought that this could be a neuroprotective agent. So the DataTop study has been produced and designed by all the best neurologists in the US, and $100 million, and 5 years later it was clear it was an artifact. The endpoints were wrongly chosen, so deprenyl had an effect on symptoms, and the first exposure to L-DOPA was the endpoint, and so in the absence of a protective effect, there was a delay of onset in L-DOPA treatment. So learning from this, we should, when we are thinking about designs to study such effects, very, very carefully, is it really possible to measure what we want to see?
I mean, I guess the way we're also thinking about aging is to not make the mistake of thinking that when you start to see clinical symptoms, that is the disease that you have to start treating. You know, that you need to be thinking about, you know, how did that disease start many years or decades earlier? I mean, Alzheimer's disease is a very good example of this. We often mix up the difference between Alzheimer's dementia and Alzheimer's disease. You know, Alzheimer's dementia is probably the end stage of a disease that started 20 or 30 years earlier, and in the dementia stage, when people are suffering from cognitive dysfunction and, you know, behavioral abnormalities and aggression and agitation and these symptoms, that's the very end of a disease, and trying to treat at that stage is very difficult. And I think up to now, most of the therapeutic approaches have tried to target that end of the spectrum. This is a disease that's probably started 20 years earlier, and I think the challenge will be, can we identify the mechanisms that go wrong at that early stage of the disease? Can we find, you know, tractable targets to go after with either biologics or with small molecules, so that we can really divert the course of the disease? But then if we think about, you know, treating diseases in that way, then it becomes even more important, how do we identify people that, you know, to all intensive purposes are healthy individuals. You know, they're not presenting with symptoms. And so we need to be able to identify these people in a cost-effective way and be able to start treatment at a time that gives them the best chance of being able to divert the eventual trajectory of Alzheimer's disease. So yeah, indeed, we're trying to invest in imaging technologies to be able to, you know, identify these types of patients. But also, you know, it's not feasible to put everybody through, say, a PET scan. So we have to start thinking about what are, you know, cheaper and higher throughput ways to identify people. So we're starting to look at things like retinal scans to be able to identify amyloid in the eye, for instance, which would be a higher throughput way to potentially identify people that might be on the path to develop Alzheimer's disease. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about regarding identifying patients. But, you know, maybe just final point on how we then think about drug discovery. In the past, when we were treating patients at the end stage of a disease, there was a certain tolerance for, you know, side effect liability or the risk of that particular, you know, drug or that particular intervention. If we're starting to treat people essentially that are healthy, then the tolerance for side effects and you know, tolerability is completely different. So we have to develop not just efficacious drugs, but super safe drugs that may be administered for 20, 30 years.
Which is why metformin's as advanced as it is right now. Actually, I went to an aging conference in St. Petersburg, Russia, back in the beginning of the year, around January or February, and it was interesting because several of the researchers are taking metformin on an ongoing basis, even though they don't have any particular disease for that, but just because of the amount of attention. I am curious about your perspective as it relates to what kind of progress we're likely to make here. And I put this in the context of what I've been saying. I've covered biotech for 14 years, and I'm still covering companies, you know, from 14 years ago that are working essentially in the same areas, and some have made progress, some have not made progress. 14 years is not necessarily a long time in the span of biotechnology. I am curious, though. I mean, there's a lot of expectations, I think, in the general public as it relates to aging R&D. But from what you know about these products, the products that either are in development, the ones that are, you know, being looked at repurposing, or all the rest, do you think we're likely to see quick progress here? I'm kind of curious in terms of how you would gauge the state of aging R&D and longevity research right now, because in my perspective, it's still quite early, although there are a variety of things going on, as it relates to how long it's going to take before we begin to see measurable progress as it relates to aging in the world. Anyone want to pick that one up? Adam, why don't you take it?
Well, I think, I think we have to take a two-prong approach. That is to continue to do basic research in these areas, because I think as you said, it's still early days, and even for the things that we think we know, we have to optimize. And at the same time, I don't think we should wait too long to bring some of at least those drugs or regimens that have been shown to be safe to implement them in some way or form. I think the challenge, as you said, though, is, you know, how do you bring this into a situation where people are already in good health? And I think this is really a vexing question. I think we need to think more about whether there are biomarkers that may be indicators of risk that are early on, or as Sylvie said, also use preventative strategies, not just drugs. I think nutrition, many of these pathways that affect longevity are nutrient sensing pathways, and nutrition is going to play a major role, I think, in our health. And I think we need to tap into this in a big way in the future. So,
well, I think in many ways prevention is really where it's at right now, because it's practical, it's realistic, it's something that can happen right now as it relates to population health.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot to be done in prevention. The issue with prevention is our system is developed to treat disease, not to prevent disease, not to treat health or improve health. And so it requires a shift also, not only in where you put resources, but the way you wire the system, if you like. What kind of incentive do you have in the system? And that's one of the areas we are discussing also. So it's not just about giving education or knowledge, but it's also about incentives so that you will promote the behavior that you want to see, rather than promoting the wrong behavior. And that implies a change in healthcare systems, for example. So that's one of the dialogue we're having. And I think also a change in the way you look at disease and the way you look at people. And you look at, I mean, you're talking about disease that start 20 years earlier, and you have to tell, or you suggest to treat healthy people. I mean, not only do you have the whole biomarker issue and diagnosis, but there's a whole concept, when am I sick then, and when am I healthy? So I think it requires a change of the way we look at things.
Well, go ahead, Gregor.
So I think another thing is to not consider diseases of aging individually. I think there's a very strong interplay between different diseases, and we are starting to more and more think about the connection of the body and the mind as people age. And, you know, these two are certainly not independent and affect each other. I mean, there's quite some data now suggesting, for instance, that the recovery of people, for instance, after cardiovascular disease or after a heart attack is significantly worse if they're also suffering from depression. So, you see the outcome of recovery from a physical condition being affected by a mental condition. I think there's other data showing that, for instance, women suffering more than 6 depressive episodes over their life have a much shorter lifespan, quite significantly, than those who have not suffered any form of depression over their life. So, there's this link between physical conditions and mental conditions that we really have to understand much more so that we treat the whole body and not just individual diseases.
Interesting.
I have a pessimistic and an optimistic view. Let me start with the pessimistic view. The hurdles to develop a safe product to be administered 30 years before the onset of the disease, it's theoretically impossible. Or no one sitting here in the room will see it, whether it worked or not. So the optimistic aspect is if it turns out that amyloid would really be the causative agent for Alzheimer's, then we have a good chance to treat patients or healthy people early by a vaccination. And I think this is a risk we can oversee and manage. And then again, no one in this room will see it, but then it might be a cure. So what we did in the past was that interventions came too late in the progression of the disease. People are also thinking whether or not we are treating Parkinsonian patients early enough. Most likely the disease also is starting years and years before the onset of motor symptoms. We know that 80% of the dopaminergic neurons have to die before we can see motor impairments. So there are chances that we find interventions which will be beneficial earlier than in 30 years.
One of the other aspects, I think, to the extent that it's successful in terms of finding new drugs and new interventions that you can use, is that you're also going to have to look at access, cost of the therapeutics. What's going to happen if these if people are taking a drug over a period of decades as opposed to acute illness or something like that? It changes the economics completely. I would like to open this up to everybody else in the audience. See if you all had any questions here about their work. We got one back here.
So if we think about an anti-aging drug, as Adam told some examples, how do you think about the clinical trial design? Because if it extends the lifespan, then I imagine that the clinical trials will be huge, like many years of clinical trials and with a lot of patients to be a significant endpoint. So how would it be the endpoints of these clinical trials?
That's a great question. First of all, in model systems, it's very easy because they live short lives, and we can and actually longevity in health. Longevity is an integrative phenotype. It's a signature of health in many cases, but we can't follow humans in the same way. So I think the idea is to look at multiple age-related diseases, and so the endpoints would look at how do their parameters look for cardiovascular disease? How do their parameters look for cancer and diabetes? And so I think this is the approach. I think an endpoint of survival, when do people die, is not necessarily a good model. Yeah.
Biomarkers become all the more important. Anybody else want to pick up on that question as it relates to clinical trial designs from the big pharma perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely clear that in our current system, payers would like to see mortality data. In the absence of a predictor of the individual lifespan, the only way around is to go to high patient numbers. Think about studies in cardiovascular diseases or diabetes. So we are talking 20, 30,000 individuals which have to be followed up long enough. The question is simply who at the end will pay for it. So we need to find other ways for the study design. We need to find other designs. We need to find other endpoints and someone who's paying for that.
Right. One of the interesting aspects of this is, though, is that we've seen with the study that's ongoing right now for metformin, is that the researchers found a ready and willing population of patients, of people, aging folk, who wanted to participate in it. There is a lot of interest in terms of aging R&D, obviously, from a lot of people, for obvious reasons. Anybody else? Oh, you got one over here.
What comes to my mind is that we have, in many cases, been looking too much into specific diseases, like take hypertension. You just treat a symptom. You don't look at the underlying cause of the disease. And what I find is lacking is a bit of the holistic perspective of the diseases, because it's a panorama of different diseases which are interacting in between. And I think that we are so narrow-minded, each of us are in a very, very narrow lane and not really knowing what each other is doing. And I think we need to have a greater perspective.
As a medic, I have to oppose a bit. When we are looking into a patient suffering from hypertension, we look into all possible causes which could result in hypertension. And only if we don't find those, we name it essential hypertension and treat it as usual. But there is more to do, but that we only think narrow-minded, go down with the hypertension, and then you are cured. This is not the reality, luckily enough.
Yes, so one of the thoughts I just had, I mean, we talk a lot about looking at the whole system rather than looking at the individual points. There's a lot of data, I mean, and we're generating a lot of data. So how can we use the data generated, whether they are, cohorts that have been followed for the last 20 years, or the data that we're generating now? How can we use the data to answer some of those questions?
I think some of the companies actually are doing a much better job about looking at things holistically. You talked about that earlier, Gregor, yourself, as a company can look at various ailments and how they interact with one another. Actually, I would add to that I would think that Europe is a little bit ahead of the United States, a lot ahead of the United States, as it relates to looking or being able to look at diseases holistically, simply because through a lot of the experiences that I've had and that I've heard of and you report on as well, is that the American system is much more fractured as it relates to changing from one payer to the next and all the different things that can happen as you move from one provider to the next with a disease. And I've seen this play out over and over again. What?
There's European diversity. For Scandinavia, Sweden, for example, I would fully agree that they have the system in place. For Germany, I simply would say no. We even didn't manage after 15 years to have a simple single patient record. So it's a lot of fragmentation here.
Okay, I stand corrected on Germany. It is interesting, though, because the more unified the system is, the better the big data is going to be as a result of that as well, because then you can start to begin to tap all these different numbers and learn from that.
Yeah, and who is identifying rare side effects of drug treatments? It's always the Swedes, so they have the systems.
Mm-hmm. Back and back.
Hi, thanks. Peter already brought up who's going to pay for this. So just when we're talking about metformin or any other longevity drugs. So I just wanted to go a little bit further with that. Are payers likely to pay for this? And how do you pick who's going to be given one of these longevity drugs if you're not treating an actual disease in itself, if it's preventative?
So if you would have nice data that metformin is prolonging life, everyone will pay for herself. It's a couple of cents per day. So just one cigarette per day less, and then it should work. I would like to come to another point. We have seen very, very often, or let's see, in more than one occasions, carefully spoken, that retrospective data analysis did show an indication that intake of a specific drug would, for example, reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease over time. It has been shown for pioglitazone, for example, and NSAIDs and other drugs, metformin now. And to my best knowledge, all the then following prospective trials failed. So we need to be very careful to take this for granted that the results will be positive. We need to have controlled studies to see what is in there.
Just an add-on to the last question and to your response. I fully agree that if the products are or deliver what the people expect, people will pay for themselves. The problem is to finance the studies, which was your point there, to finance the studies, because the commercial sector will not have the incentives that the pharma industry has had in other areas.
I don't want to dominate this discussion here with the German view, but the biggest problem I see is the reimbursement for repurposing. So the most efficient way to develop a new product is to find a new indication for an already known molecule where we know side effects and effects, things like that. A number of all pharmaceutical companies would be willing to invest in such a product with a new indication. However, in the markets, it's not possible to regain the money because in a generic market, everyone will use the cheap generics instead of the then new licensed product. And as long as we don't find a solution for that, we are losing a huge opportunity for really new treatments for a number of diseases, and this is not good. So 2 things if you are talking to your guy in the parliament. Think about repurposing and try to make sure that diagnostics are being paid. If this would happen in Germany, we would really have a big step forward for pharmaceutical development in the future.
I should add to that you know, we've talked a lot about metformin, but as you said, that's repurposing a well-known drug, but that shouldn't prevent us from continuing to do research and new discovery, because we may find other drugs that are perhaps even better or have less side effects. And I think this is an important point, that we don't just say, oh, we know enough now, let's stop and only use this. I think metformin opens the door to a new way of thinking, and we think that this will, I think the ultimate goal will have, that this will lead to other compounds being used as well.
And I think pharma companies are realizing, you know, for these big societal challenges, you know, that, you know, where the cost of could potentially bankrupt certain societies, but certain healthcare providers, you know, we have to look for novel ways to collaborate, to share data, to share ways of doing things so that we're not all doing the same thing and making the same mistakes, you know, looking for ways to form pre-competitive consortia so that we kind of move the whole field forward. And I alluded to in my introduction about things like EPAD, the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease platform, is, you know, has been supported by multiple pharma companies. It's looking to standardize clinical trials in Alzheimer's therapeutics, to use well-defined clinical cohorts, to be able to run adaptive trial designs so that we can test more mechanisms and hopefully be able to identify quickly the ones that are really having a positive benefit versus ones that are really not, you know, impacting the disease at all. So I think there's a lot of these initiatives now going on. So I hope, you know, collaboration will be one of the ways that we actually address that problem.
So, one last question. First, good evening, everyone, and thank you for this interesting discussion. And my question will be actually in 2 parts. First part, when you talk about repurposing, we are talking about expansion of application. So will I understand that Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson will be holding the patent and then we substitute it? This is one in terms of regulatory one. And second, will the academical, the research or the clinician have access to the data that you have? Because as far as I heard at the beginning that, okay, there are so many other compounds that they didn't make their way till the market. However, that was for non-safety issues. So in order to save time, save money, and the human power, will we have access to the reasons and the data that our CEO, Sylvie Bouvet, just mentioned, that we have so many data and we are generating so many data in order also to avoid this IT power needs? So will we have access on these two?
Yeah, I mean, for the clinical data, everyone has access to all data which have been produced beyond phase 1. All clinical studies after 2006 are available online. When you are reading this recent publication on the big gaps there, at least for Pfizer, it's a plain lie. We did report everything except for one study where we were 4 weeks late in submitting the final study results. All the other deficits are to be explained by other things. So in principle, Johnson & Johnson and whoever data are available. And what the researcher has to do to get in contact with Pfizer is to have an idea about the mechanism of action of the product. They should have a look at the data which are available, and then they simply can ask, why did you stop your program? And then we can tell you the good reasons, and then you can decide on your own whether you would like to find investors or whether you would like to have Pfizer being involved with others. So a number of issues.
And some of these molecules are actually quite cheap when you try to get them back. I've seen them purchased by some startup companies for not a tremendous amount of money. So there are different things that you can do. Lilly and Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline have sold some of these for really just lunch money as it relates to biopharma as a whole.
I think, just to make this point, I think we spoke a little bit earlier about who's going to pay for all this, and I think there's a huge hidden cost of treating people with age-related diseases that we're swallowing, and it's going to get much worse with the demography and with dementias, and so that's the cost that we're worried about. And I think if we can fund some of these studies and get some information about whether we can use these broad-based therapies, the goal ultimately will be to reduce those costs. And I think, to compress morbidity into a shorter number of years, and that's what we really want to do.
Okay, well, we've run a little bit over time, which is always a good sign. Appreciate the panelists for turning out. It was a fascinating conversation on something that we'll be discussing for a long time. And thanks for everybody else for coming out as well. Appreciate it.